still get the same buzz out of it, Frank?
Absolutely. Truthfully, so I love it. I'm for the Formula One stuff, the real stuff. The speed they're gaining through the corners. It's Superman, so I believe these guys metamorph when they get into the cockpit, you know, because they're immensely quick. And the grip around the corners is just astonishing.
Maybe we can carry on inside, or because it's just a bit noisy for us.
If you're a pilot flying a jet, that's wonderful work, isn't it? Why? Because I'm flying supersonic, twice supersonic. It blows my mind at red as the speeds at which they can control these cars. What was it? Top Gun? What did Mav say to Goose? He said, I feel the need for speed. I've never forgotten that.
And you've always had that?
Sorry?
You've always had that?
Well, I've always been a little boy for a start and always enjoyed speed too. That's how I finished up in the chair going too fast.
We didn't sit around the table as a family and discuss it and go, this is how we're going to deal with it. Or, you know, Mum needs some counselling, the kids need counselling, Dad needs counselling to get through it. We've never talked about it as a family, Dad's accident, ever.
I was trying to fight panic, I think. He was clinging onto that life by a thread. And he was actually dying every day for 6 weeks, which is a long time.
If it wasn't for Mum, I personally don't think Williams would necessarily be around. I'm a really firm believer in Williams is not just always about Dad, it's as much about Mum. She stood by him through thick and thin. I mean, she saved his life.
Like a mental quadriplegic was sort of on my mind. I was sort of alone and I was in a very bad state.
Williams is unique now in that it is the last of the old style teams where the team owners all had their name over the door and Williams is the only one left.
Frank's very rare at interviews nowadays, so he doesn't seem as approachable or accessible from a fan on the street. Whether we see enough of him nowadays and whether that's because of his health, we didn't see him this weekend. We saw Claire Williams knocking about on Friday. She's a great face on the TV as well, where, you know, being interviewed and the like. It's interesting to have a lady as principal as well.
I think I may have had like the odd grand dream, but I never thought I would be given the keys to the shop, ever. Ever, ever. I think a bit of it's because I'm a girl and, you know, I can't possibly understand anything about a car. And, you know, it's Dad's train set. He doesn't want to hand it over to anybody else.
The Marussia of Will Stevens gets out of the way of Valtteri Bottas and Max Verstappen, but Verstappen's all over the back of that Williams.
What about Williams? Where do you reckon Williams will place today?
Might get a point. One in the top 10, maybe.
Do you think they're contenders anymore?
No, definitely not this year. No chance.
But Jack, you were the last driver to win a World Championship for Williams.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
How long ago was that?
97, so 20 years ago. Yes.
Long time.
Not too long, really, yeah.
In comes Bottas, goes for another set. He's just given up. There's nothing they could do, really, and I'm afraid that Williams are going to come away from Monaco with nothing.
It's really frustrating. It literally is banging your head against a brick wall. What do we have to do? You know, I have to walk around with my head held high, and I want to be able to do that. And I don't feel that I can at the moment.
Do you think Frank feels it as acutely as you do now?
I'm sure he does, yeah. He's trusted in me, and I don't want him to ever doubt that trust that he's put in me.
Do you ever doubt it yourself? Or?
Not right now. No. I've got a lot of fight in me left.
Claire is a tough piece of work. Whatever she sets out to do, she always achieves it. She's a bit like her mother. Her mother was like that. Didn't make a lot of fuss, just did things.
I love this time of year, though, with the autumn coming. And these are my mum's blossom trees that we planted. They look a bit dead now. These were the ones that we planted on the 2-year anniversary of her passing. I wanted something here that I could come to and chat to.
And do you do that?
Yeah, I do, a lot. I come and ask her why we can't fix our the wheel nuts on our pit stops, and pray to her that she might help the guys in R&D that have been working so hard on them. I've got a whole box of press clippings in there from when I was made deputy team principal, and I thought I would frame them and put them up and be all proud of myself, but now they've just ended up in the shed. This is a lovely picture from when we won the race in Barcelona with Pasta.
Was this the last time you won a race?
Last time we won a race, Barcelona 2012. So there's another picture of Dad. Someone sent that to me. It was amazing, lifting 2 wheel nuts. How buff was my dad? It was amazing. It was phenomenal how fit he was before his accident. This is an awful article that came out where Mum did an extract from her book.
After the accident, I think Ginny was on the edge of a nervous breakdown, and she found communication on an emotional level very difficult with Frank. Frank didn't do emotion. And she perhaps felt that a book might be one way of getting the story across to him. I'm not usually given to making New Year's resolutions, but at the end of 1988 I decided that I would spend the following year setting down everything that has happened to Frank and me in the last 2 decades. These are the little micro-tapes. They took about 6 hours of conversation. That goes in there.
He's not a man who talks about his feelings. Never. Yeah. Absolutely never.
How long is it since you listened to these?
Probably not since I first transcribed them. Which, so it is, it's 25 years ago. I mean, she sounds so alive today. 25 years later, I can relive that conversation. I feel very sad that she's not here anymore.
I feel I should hug you or kiss you or something. I feel I know you so well already.
Well, looking at you, I feel I know you so well. Really?
It's a bit weird.
It is weird.
Really?
Yes.
Do I look like Mum?
You do.
It was so weird because she always didn't tell anyone in the family, but there was all this kind of quite suspicious behaviour going on, kind of sneaking out, or, you know, I found a dictaphone in her glove box. I was convinced she was having an affair and confronted her with it, and she still didn't tell me that that's what she was doing.
I can't remember which year it was, but Frank set up a company that looked after young guys' racing cars. And I was due to marry this guy, and he was the car into Frank's stable, and we went together to either see the car or to see the mechanic, and that was when I saw Frank in a very glossy garage in Slough.
She actually met Frank about 3 months before she was due to get married, and that her fiancé introduced her to Frank. And there was an instant sort of electric connection between her and Frank. She was only, I think, 20. She was very young. And she thought, what can I do? The flowers are ordered, the wedding, oh.
I didn't know what to do. I mean, there's this guy with his eyes boring at you, and you couldn't speak. You couldn't articulate a word. I wanted to be terribly intelligent and say things about cars, and I couldn't do it. Once I saw him, that was it.
Well, she's blonde, blue eyes, beautiful thick head of hair, beautiful manners, beautiful clothes, came from quite a wealthy background.
She had this lovely way of speaking, a great sense of humour, and she loved motor racing. She understood motor racing. She had a very good feel for racing drivers.
Frank probably thought, you're not going to believe it, she went to a finishing school in Switzerland, they've got Labradors in the garden, I've cracked it. I suspect that's what he told his mates.
I mean, she was just a fantastic girl to talk to. It's like talking to a fella. But, you know, with wearing Chanel No. 5, it's just brilliant.
But in those days, to back out of a marriage or a looming wedding was almost impossible to do. You know, invitations had gone out and stuff like that, and it would have been very tough for her to pull the plug on it.
Anyway, she went through with the wedding, but this attraction didn't go away.
It was the charm. It was the Frank Williams charm, I think, that smile and the big green eyes, and Mum just went loony.
I mean, I remember going across the road and she's sitting in a minicar. I said, what are you doing here? She said, bro, don't say anything to anybody. And she had a flask and sandwiches, and she'd been sitting there for 9 o'clock, hoping Frank would go across the road and buy a paper at the newsagents, and she could get out and say, oh, Frank, fancy bumping into you here. And she didn't do it once. She did it all week.
I mean, from then on, my whole occupation was either looking for Frank or riding to Slough, or making sure that when we were at a race that I put myself in a prominent position. I think that I planned that I was going to marry Frank one way or the other. I wanted to.
It was a real magical world. The world Frank started racing. It was this, you know, boys' club, and I think Frank, he loved being a part of it, and maybe because he hadn't been a part of a gang, a group, when he was, you know, in his childhood.
He doesn't ever talk about it, but his mother was deserted by father, and his mother was very poor.
My father left. He was a bomber pilot, left my mother. My mother brought me up. She did bring me up pretty much single-handedly.
They lived in Jarrow in South Shields. That was a difficult environment, difficult to make your way out of. And my grandma made the choice. She would sacrifice the normal home environment in order to try and give Dad a better chance in life by giving him this education.
My first memories were being sent to a Roman Catholic convent. I was about just coming up for 5. And I used to run away at the railway station, and they used to ring up and say, "He's here again, please stop this happening again." Whenever I got back to the school, they took my little trousers down and hit me with a weight at a coat hanger. I didn't mind. I was quite happy at the school.
You were happy at school?
I was happy at the school, yes.
So why did you run away then?
Because I wasn't that happy. No, but it was and also I love trains and movement. I was always trying to get a ride in a car. You know, when someone's dad turned up with the cars all over the car, and sometimes they gave me a ride up and down the road in it. I was nuts about cars by then.
I think Frank was confined in Dumfriesshire for the whole of his education from the age of 4 until I think at 16.
I did qualify for uni, but I had no interest because I was in a convent for 3 years, 1 year in a day school, then another 9 years locked up as well. I was kind of keen on freedom. I bought for £80 a racing A35. It's a hot little ship, I can tell you, a very quick car. And that's how I got into motor racing proper.
He was totally obsessed by motor racing. I mean, to a degree that was ridiculous, ridiculous. Nothing else mattered. I don't think he's ever been in a supermarket in his life. Frank, when he first went there wasn't any room for him, so he slept in the lockups down the side there in a sleeping bag. Everybody had a nickname. Roger Bunting was Bunt. Charles Lucas was Charlie Luke. Piers Courage was called Porridge. And Frank's was called Wanks. Is Wanks around? No, he'll be in later. Oh, OK.
They were all aristocratic, wealthy guys who wanted to go motor racing, and Frank was mixing with them. And he wasn't either aristocratic or wealthy.
And they were all over 10 years. And I'm thinking, for him, it must have been such a different world.
Well, all the other guys that lived in that flat had hereditary incomes. Frank didn't, nor did I. So Frank had to earn some money. So the way he earned money was to buy and sell parts. And every waking moment, he was chasing around the country, buying stuff for £1 and selling it for £2. He called himself Frank William Racing Cars in the end.
The motivation behind the organisers wanting certain drivers was that in France they had to have Matchlers, they had to have Beltoirs and Servos, Gavin starting. Italy had to have a Ferrari on the grid, and I guess England particularly wanted a BRM.
He seemed to me to be the ultimate wheeler dealer. And then he expanded and expanded, and pretty soon he was selling a lot of cars to European drivers, particularly in Italy.
So Frank would get a phone call from an Italian customer. Hey, Franco, what are you going to give me for my car? I need a new Brabham. I'll give you X for it. OK, I'll come and get it. He's got an order from the same customer for a brand new car. He'd then take that car apart, repaint it, re-electroplate it, repolish it, and it would be 3 months later a totally immaculate, brand new looking car with a brand new chassis number that he got out the back door of Brabham. The guy would then get the car back, and what he actually got back was the original car. I know one guy had the same car for at least 3 years, but he thought he got a new car every year.
I think that I was always likely to rebel. It might have been that I was looking for a bit of, what's the word, a bit of scruff.
Ginny had grown up in a very sheltered environment, and suddenly there was this man who didn't go by the rules, and he was very exciting.
We'd go to parties on Saturday night, and Frank's dancing with Ginny, and it's getting obscene. And her husband has got daggers coming out of his eyes. And I walked up to Frank and said, Frank, what the fuck are you doing? I said, you can't be doing this. Have a normal dance. I mean, you know, the only thing he wasn't doing was having sex. And Frank said, oh, I hadn't noticed. And Ginny said, well, I certainly hadn't. What everybody else said. And of course, the show was on the road there with them two.
And she moved into a flat. And then she thought, how do I let Frank know that I'm here? Because I mustn't let him know that I've left my first husband because of him. That will scare him off. So he didn't drink, but what he loved was fresh orange juice. So she wrote a letter. If you fancy some fresh orange juice, it's now being served at, and she put her new address. And a day or two later, doorbell rang and he turned up at the door.
Looking for some orange juice?
Looking for some orange juice, obviously.
I thought Frank Williams like a very good start from the back. He's now in third place from about the third row of the grid. That's very good indeed.
Back then, his whole thing was to be the greatest racing driver in the world.
And who's the yellow car?
Frank Williams.
There? It's Frank. Look at him singling. What a battle with these two saloons. Why weren't the managers...
He was racing saloon cars, but for some reason, he never had an inbuilt limit. He would just go faster and faster and faster and fly off the circuit.
And who's up there?
Frank Williams.
Frank Williams, trying too hard. Frank always very fast but very hairy, and he's living up to it.
When I started doing Formula 3, sometimes I would encounter people who would say to me, do you know that chap Frank Williams? Yeah, I know Frank Williams. Oh, he's so fast, and he crashed here, and he overtook here, and he did all kinds of things. So Frank had this amazing reputation as someone who was lightning fast, not always staying on the road.
There were a lot of races he would have won, but he ended up spinning the car and having accidents. He just didn't have a limit, and that extended to his road driving as well.
Well, what was that like?
Diabolical.
Where did you learn to drive?
In my mother's Morris 1000. She was very reluctant to lend it to me. And she was right, because in the end I did roll it on his roof.
But you've rolled a few cars in your time.
Not that many, no.
Oh, it's just that every time we talk about a car, it seems to be one that you've rolled.
Well, I haven't talked about that many cars, though, have I?
Didn't you? What was your first racing car?
A35.
What happened to that?
I got rolled.
He was nothing but competitive against himself in a road car. It was almost at the point where he would start a stopwatch to see if he could beat his previous time from A to B.
And Frank every night used to come in and say, 33.5 minutes tonight, Ginny. I'm going to kill myself on that road if I'm not careful. And I used to sweat and say, if you kill yourself, I'm not coming to your funeral. It used to make me so cross. Frank was a suicide lane driver.
And I think it dawned on him that pretty soon he was going to hurt himself. You can't have that many accidents on the road and on racetracks. You know, you end up hurting yourself, especially back then, when the cars were lethal.
What got me into Formula One was the fact that after 2 or 3 years of racing rather dangerously around the continent, it became apparent that I might have lots of courage, but nothing like enough skill to go with it. At the same time, I became very friendly with a young man called Piers Courage, who was a brilliant driver.
And the opportunity came for Frank to build a Formula One car, and Piers agreed to drive it.
And then Piers and I set off in 1969.
Piers Courage was an ebullient, fashionable Formula One driver that captured the imagination of everybody who loved Formula One. And Piers was just Frank's idea of what a Grand Prix driver should be like.
He was just bouncy, easily charming, had a beautiful wife from half of London was chasing.
Apart from being a great-looking fella, never had a hair or a piece of clothes out of place. Was always the smartest guy. Button-down blazer, grey flannels, Gucci shoes. He looked almost holy.
And I remember him making a speech. He had a slight sort of English public school stammer. And I remember the interviewer saying, so Piers, how's your car going to go this weekend? And he said, well, I think it'll go like an absolute bomb, actually.
Hoping to go one better than his second placing last year was Piers Courage and the very promising Frank Williams-backed De Tomaso.
I remember last year my right foot had a terrific cramp in it, and also the great blisters on my hands from the gear changing.
Well, I kind of adored Piers in many ways, but in those days it was just, Piers is wonderful, that's because my mate, and I thought the world of him.
Piers and Frank were great together. They were almost made for each other, I think. You had Piers, who was really developing as a driver, and Frank was really developing as a team owner, constructor.
Second place at Monte Carlo, can you believe that? Second place at the US Grand Prix, can you believe that? Fifth at Silverstone, had a great run.
Everybody wanted to be a racing driver, and Piers was on his way. He'd beaten Jackie Stewart and Jim Clark, and he was a really, really good driver. And suddenly, he dies in this horrendous accident in Frank's car.
I was in the race and it was a terrible accident involving us knowing that it was Pierce that had the accident because his helmet came off.
And when you heard the news, how did you hear the news?
Well, all I will say is that it was a major shock. I was very young. You didn't expect a shock like that. And I remember I went to the race organiser, a man called John Korschmidt, and I said, John, just tell me, is Piers dead? Are you sure he's dead? And he said, I'm sure. And I said, tell me that again. He told me, he is dead, Frank. 3 times. I said, okay. Then I had the job of telling his wife, Piers' wife, and I'd rather not talk about that.
His wife, Sally, was in a terrible state. Wives in motor racing, I think, have had a much tougher life than any driver has.
And I remember going to the funeral, and Frank was fantastic. He stood at the entrance to the church and welcomed everybody in. And there were a lot of people. Shook hands with everybody, thanked them for coming. And then after the ceremony, I couldn't find him. And I walked back into the church, it was deserted, and Frank was standing behind a big stone pillar, absolutely destroyed, standing there weeping his heart out. And I said, come on, love, let's go home. And it was like that happy-go-lucky scene we had just dissolved like that.
But I know that it wasn't really mentioned, and Piers wasn't mentioned terribly much at home. I'm not sure I'm not sure how you would get over a driver dying in your car.
This ability of Frank to carry on, for me, it's fairly standard in motor racing. Knowing racing people, most of them only think of tomorrow. Very rarely do they look back, and very rarely do they allow emotion to come into their motivation.
There was a very high mortality rate, stupidly high, and it was just accepted that you probably weren't going to survive. I personally did not think I would survive my Formula One career, and the odds weren't very good.
On the second lap, disaster strikes. One trips, loses control. But the race goes on.
Those cars were effectively death traps. You had a head-on on one of those, they folded up round you like an envelope. You didn't get out of them.
The cars so readily caught fire. The fuel systems, in a minor impact, nearly always sprung a leak, and the fires were the thing.
We had a series of deaths, one each weekend for 4 consecutive weekends. 4 of our friends died.
The ethos of Formula One was back then, if this happens, it's appalling, but we're going to the next stage like falling off a horse. You climb back on again.
So this is an article, gosh, this dad did an interview with the Times after Ayrton died. Formula One, one of the most powerful figures in Formula One, bears his soul in his star driver's death and the revival of his team. Dad says, it hasn't all sunk in yet. You see the fact of Ayrton's death. The same slowness of thought helped me get over my own accident. I suppose that is why I'm so calm about expressing the fact that he is dead.
The former world motor racing champion Ayrton Senna has been pronounced clinically dead. Senna suffered serious head injuries when his car left the track and crashed into a concrete wall.
I remember at Ayrton's memorial service, Mum said, don't you dare cry. She said, this is not your time to be sad. She said, this is not your loss. Mum was a very loving lady. She was very much of that mentality, stiff upper lip, exactly like Dad. I think they both probably thought that emotion was weak.
Well, it's not common for men to show serious emotion. Maybe anger, but that's about all. But no, they should never start crying or any of that stuff.
You should never start crying, or.
I shed a few tears when Piers was killed, definitely. And when Ayrton died, I mean, my responsibility.
When Ayrton died?
Yeah, sure. But it's our responsibility. He was in a racing car operated by us, as was Piers. You know, it was a Williams-operated car.
And so how did you feel on that day?
Far from well.
Here he comes down the outside. That's a brave place to try and overtake.
Oh, mamma mia. Oh, they're going to touch.
Bottas has a line. They hit, and Raikkonen's off this time. Good. Raikkonen goes out.
We are operating on a budget of approximately 110 million sterling a year. And the likes of Red Bull and Ferrari and Mercedes are operating on 2, if not 3 times that budget. So from a financial perspective, you could call us an underdog. I think that's the negative connotation for me, is it gives this sense that Williams are weaker than anyone else, but we're not. We've been through a lot more than a lot of teams on the grid, and we've always come out fighting.
And it's Bottas who finishes in 3rd place. Superb podium for him after the incident with Raikkonen earlier on.
Finally, a podium for Williams.
So happy, and my heart hasn't stopped going yet. That was quite intense.
In 3rd place, from Finland, Valtteri Bottas.
Did your mum get to see you in this role?
No, she didn't. Which, you know, for me is really sad. It's kind of heartbreaking, really. I'm sad about that, but I'm more sad that she hasn't seen the team turn around, because that was what she desperately wanted to see that broke her heart, really, at the end.
We've been living together for 2 years. I don't think he considered that he had any obligation towards me. And there was a limit to how long I felt I wanted to go along with that. I did get pregnant with the idea of forcing the issue.
I began to realise that if I did want a wife, she was the best I was ever likely to find.
But he was leaving, and he said that I think it would be a good idea if we got married. What do I think? And I was thrilled. I couldn't believe it, really. I was almost hopping about with joy.
Well, it wasn't a posh wedding, you know, with white stuff everywhere. I think it was a what do you call that thing? A registry, whatever.
Registry office.
Thank you very much.
I think Dad had said that he would sort the registry office out and never did, and would get the rings but didn't have any money, so Mum had to borrow money from Dave Brody, I think it was, that bought the ring.
So that's it. I went there, called round early, gave them £8, never got that back, didn't expect it back.
It was all over in 15 minutes. Her parents certainly weren't there. I'm not sure they approved of the match.
Out we went, and I said, oh, this is a great day, let's have a celebration. I'm going to buy you all a spectacular lunch. Frank said, not me, you're not. I'm working. And he fucked off. That was it.
I don't know what man in his right mind would think that that was okay, but, you know, Dad did, and Dad went back to work, and Mum went to lunch and probably really didn't think very much of it because she was used to it by then. Dad is a completely different beast to most normal men.
Frank, from when I first met him, always seemed very fit and athletic. And he was forever running. Every night was a long run.
He ran every circuit that we were at the racetrack. He used to run round it, and he felt bad if he didn't. You know, it was like a drug for him.
Frank is very, what would be called focused. Some people could say narrow. I mean, some people find Frank a bit unusual now and think it's because of the accident. Well, it isn't. He was always very unusual.
In Frank, there's a huge amount of repression. There's a huge amount of determination. There is an extraordinary retentive obsessiveness. I suppose motor racing people in general are the most intensely competitive people I've ever known. They're not very mature intellectually or culturally because they neither read nor think very much except about what they actually do, to which they think to an extraordinary degree.
You were always fairly antisocial. I think motor racing people are fairly insular.
I've never been close to Frank socially. I mean, we've never I don't know. I don't think we've ever been out for dinner together.
He felt that anything that involved socialising and having a drink or relaxing was actually a waste of time.
He hasn't got any interest outside motor racing. He doesn't read. He really doesn't have anything going on in his life at all, apart from motor racing.
I am addicted to motor racing. Frank Williams declared uncompromisingly, motor racing is what matters most in my life. And then he goes, well, I have a family, which I love very much, but they tend to take second place to the business. There's no question about that.
But did you used to do the family holiday type thing?
Never done that. Never. I was too late now anyway. Never interested in that.
Oh my God, well, this is embarrassing. Mum wanted a hotel to take the 3 kids to, and family tradition was to have a picture of all of us on the balcony with Mum. So that's me and Mum. This would have been, I was 16. Look at me, horrendous. So in total, went to Marbella with Mum 32 times, 32 years.
How many times did you take them?
Never. Not once.
And that didn't bother you?
No. Mum always used to tell us there's no point having your father here because he would drive us all mad. So we just used to go down there and we had a lovely time.
Get that wheel, fast you can, the bottom one. Joe, have we got another wheel mounted?
Which were the years that someone described as Frank at that time was the all-time least
successful? 72, 73, 74, 75, 76. I mean, it used to be a bit of a joke amongst the drivers. If you wanted to wreck your career, drive a Williams.
Frank endured a lot of piss-taking for his efforts, and he was the poor northerner that didn't have a pot to piss in, and his cars were rubbish, and he didn't have half the parts for them.
Frank couldn't afford new tyres and was racing with second-hand Firestone tyres, I think.
I wish they'd banned tyres, they're just too many.
If Ginny hadn't been there, Williams wouldn't have made it, because a lot of the money that kept it going was hers.
You were very hard up when you first got married.
No, I think I did have it. I had a sort of running allowance, which was, I don't know, £40 a month. Well, it sounds pathetic, but in fact in those days it wasn't that pathetic, because you could certainly feed yourself on a £5 a week for 2 people. And it was insignificant, but it just kept us ticking over.
I remember Ginny gave him £8 once to go out and buy some fish and chips, I think it was. And he went out and bought 8 Champion sparking plugs and never came back for 3 days.
No, I don't think my parents were happy when they learnt that she'd sold her flat to help Frank and to give him a bit of the money. If there was a common denominator through the first decade of his relationship with Virginia, would be penury.
Frank had such a bad reputation with the banks. I mean, bounce checks for sort of 10 years on people. And Frank just, I mean, nobody would take a check from Frank. He used to bounce checks on me. I used to say, look, I've got to have some money. He didn't give you 20 quid. He used to bounce it.
Frank Williams' team is at its lowest ebb. The cars are well down the grid in 7th and 9th places.
You're on game 6 races. If you don't win, you haven't got the money. And if you haven't got the money, you can't win. So we were in very bad shape financially.
Frank came round to see me and said, bro, I can't carry on. And he had a bit of paper with the debts on it, and they were huge. And then overnight, this guy who'd been creeping around with Frank and giving him little bits of money, Walter Wolf, did something that happens in business all the time.
Walter bought out Frank's debt and took control of the Williams Formula One team.
Walter was clearly a pretty clever businessman. He had made a fortune, like many, many tens of millions by himself. I thought, let's give this a crack.
But by halfway through 1976, it was very plain to Walter the race team wasn't running well, and that Frank didn't have the capability to turn it around.
And then Frank went to the factory, put his key in the front door, wouldn't work. Then the side window opened and the guy said, Frank, that's your things there, you can't come in the factory, you're banned from the factory now. You couldn't believe it, he'd been locked out of his own factory. It was his life. His life was in that box and inside that factory. And then 6 weeks later, where Frank's car, which was renamed a Wolf, went down to South America, won its first race. The thing that Frank had been living for all those years.
We heard the result. Somebody phoned through the result, and I was devastated. I mean, how is one supposed to feel? And I hated, above all else, seeing the Williams called a Wolf. I hated it.
One day, Ginny phoned me up, and she said, "Brad, I've got a lot of problems with Frank. He's in a fit of depression. He hasn't got out of his pyjamas for 6 weeks." So I turned up at 11 o'clock, and I looked at him, I said, "What the fuck's going on here, Frank? You got your pyjamas on." And he said, "Broad, I can't quite get my mind together about things." And I knew what was killing him.
Depression certainly wouldn't be in his... It's barely in his vocabulary. And what I think he is ashamed that he should perhaps think to himself, in this case, there is reason to be depressed, and we've got to go through depression to get out of it.
I said to Frank, "Well, there must be some way you can get into Formula One again." And he said, "Well, I don't know. He said, "But I've been thinking about it, and I might be able to get 185,000 out of a Belgian beer company called Bellevue. But we'd have to have a Belgian guy called Patrick Neve as driver." I said, "So what? That's the start of a new Formula One team. Do you think so?" I said, "Yeah, Frank." I said, "Get out in them poxy pyjamas and go to work. Do what you're best at."
I think it gave Frank a kick to realise, hang on a minute, I'm going to do it.
We sat at my kitchen table. I said, "Right, you do a list of Formula One team names, and I'll do a list."
And what was the name that you came up with?
It was really tough, really testing, very brain-stretching, but we kept Williams Grand Prix engineering elevated.
I said, "Right, I'm taking 2 days off. We're going to go and find a factory." Yeah.
It was very much hand to mouth, but I loved what I was doing. I'm very optimistic, and I thought it would all come right. At the end of the day, when you're a racer, you're a racer. It's a bit of a bug.
A bug?
Gets you.
$140,000 fans packed into Silverstone. So Hamilton's on the right as we look at it. Nico Rosberg on the left. The British Grand Prix about to get underway. Lights out, away we go, and who's it going to be? It's a good start from the second row, the Williams and Massa. Williams are getting both cars past both Mercedes. Massa leads, Bottas trying to get second from Hamilton. Hamilton in a bit of trouble, but he's fighting back. But we have a race on our hands. What a start from the Williams guys.
I think Valtteri is quicker.
He's quicker,
He should pass him.
Be careful, be careful. And he's off. Hamilton goes off in his attempts to try and wrest the lead, and that might give an opportunity here for Valtteri Bottas. Bottas goes into second place. And up front, it's Williams, 1 and 2 at the moment.
Can't watch it. I can't find that unbearable. My heart can't take it. I'll have a heart attack.
Bottas comes in from the race lead as Lewis Hamilton continues around the track. Let's see how the stop goes for Valtteri Bottas. It's pretty good. Hamilton's already along the start-finish straight. He's alongside. Hamilton retakes the lead. And where does Bottas come back out? He comes back out behind his teammate Felipe Massa. Oh, Hamilton is pulling away in front. Lewis Hamilton wins the British Grand Prix. He had to fight for it. Ultimately, Williams have to settle for 4th and 5th, but you have to feel for Williams.
I think he's always shown a sort of terrific fighting spirit. and that really the fighting spirit was stronger when things were difficult. But I think that he did have a terrific drive. But I still think he was fighting for the whole thing as a whole, rather than winning. He was fighting for Formula One.
Patrick Head is the technical genius inside Williams, the engineer SWAT who bestows power on the charismatic leader.
And I met Patrick, which is the best thing, apart from marrying the wife I married, the best thing ever happened to me in my life. He was a gifted engineer.
Patrick is a person who, he doesn't suffer fools gladly.
Well, he's a bully. If he wanted it and he wasn't coming, he'd bully his way through.
A lot of people are frightened of him. You know, he's a broad guy and he can be quite aggressive looking, but his character is not one that junior employees found comfortable. You know what I mean? They knew when they'd made a mistake.
I think most of my father's forebears were military. One of them, General Michael Head, had been a soldier under Wellington. I think not wanting to fail was a very strong motivation.
This car's half a second slower on the stopwatch than the other car. Yeah.
I think at this point Frank had fairly high hopes and expectations of Patrick.
The thing that was unique that Patrick brought to the show, he was responsible for making Formula One reliable. So Frank's cars almost instantly finished races, which they hadn't been doing before. And that's where life changed for Williams.
The British teams have kept ahead with innovative designs, the most recent being the aerodynamic skirt, a rigid panel that scrapes along the ground between the front and rear wheels, creating a phenomenon called ground effect. For Frank Durney, a simple graph shows the rise in suction under the Williams with skirts.
If you remove the skirt, you actually get so little flow in this area.
The thing that really made a big difference was a fairing along the side of the engine which allowed the flow to remain attached all the way to the back. And I tested that in a wind tunnel test just before Silverstone in 1979, and it was the biggest gain of performance I've ever seen on a car. So I rushed back from the wind tunnel and drew the parts, and we got them made so we could use them at Silverstone.
I remember going out there and hopping in it for the first time and thinking, bloody hell.
What was the difference with the car?
It was better. It was just better. Don't start getting me trying to be technical, because I'll look like a complete goose.
We went to the test, and in the morning everybody had been running, and I think the best lap time would have been, I don't know, 12.9 or something by somebody. And Alan went out. I remember the time, absolutely, he did a 1 minute 11.88, just like that, bang. And the rest of the pit lane were doing mid-13s. And it was most peculiar, because you were standing there with your thing, and everybody went and looked down at us. They just could not believe it.
I would say that when the Jonesy thing came together in '79, everybody was as surprised as everybody. I mean, I think Frank was as equally surprised as anybody else.
In practice, Alan Jones in the Saudi Williams has slashed an incredible 7 seconds off the record, and that's a lot these days.
Alan was a man's man. He was an Aussie, he's all you expect from an Aussie. Maybe, you know, big character, strong personality, took no nonsense from anybody.
He liked his fun, he liked to drink. I think he always had a bit of a struggle keeping his weight down. After a race, you'd nearly always see him pouring a beer down his throat, or 2 or 3.
In motorsport, there's 2 good reasons to have a bit of a drink. One's to commiserate, one's to celebrate. So you're pretty safe either way you're going to have a beer.
2 Williams in the first 2 rows. The incredible veteran, the Swiss driver, Clay Regazzoni.
Well, Clay's not as quick as he used to be. He's now very much a number 2 driver. He's number 2 to Alan Jones in the Williams team.
We all sort of expected Regazzoni to be quicker than Jones, but he never was. And Jones turned out to be much, much better than any of us had realised, I think.
Now, all ready for the 68-lap British Grand Prix. Two Saudia Williams cars first into Cops Corner. And they're coming through. That's Jabouille. Jean-Pierre Jabouille is going to go through. He's got tremendous speed and power here. 510 horsepower. And it is still Alan Jones leads now.
When Alan took the lead quite quickly and disappeared, Patrick and I were just counting the laps, praying for the laps to keep reducing. Because there was a new car that wasn't necessarily reliable. And when this was about to be a major event for the team, it's beginning to look like reality.
And Alan Jones pulling away now.
I was leading very comfortably. And then all of a sudden, in the rear view mirrors, I saw a hell of a lot of smoke coming out of the back of the car, and I thought there was something wrong for sure.
And that is trouble for Alan Jones. That is the way he's coasting. It looks as though he's burst his engine.
And I should have hung around for the end of the race, but I was that pissed off. I just jumped in my car and went back to London at about 300 miles an hour.
So, Clay Regazzoni is the new leader of the 33rd British Grand Prix. Clay Regazzoni almost home to win the first race ever for the Saudia Williams team, and Frank Williams will be beside himself with joy. And Clay Regazzoni goes across the line and he has won the British Grand Prix.
We were so much quicker than anyone else, even though Clay was nowhere near as fast as Alan. And of course, when Alan broke down, he won.
We won the British Grand Prix. I mean, you couldn't put it in a book. It was incredible.
Clay, what is so good about this Williams car?
Everything.
It was the first win for Frank Williams in Formula One since he started over a decade previously.
Frank Williams, this must be the happiest day of your motor racing life.
No doubt about that, you're right, yes.
Frank, what were your feelings during those last few laps?
Well, sheer terror that the car wouldn't finish. We'd lost out and I was terrified of losing Clay, but the car was very sweet.
Frank, we've watched you struggling, if I may say so, in motor racing since 1969. Frank Williams, the man who's kept trying for Britain. Many congratulations. Thank you, Frank.
I think my parents just, after everyone had gone, just sat there, just on the sofa of the caravan, arm in arm, and just didn't want the day to end. It was surreal.
But so what did that feel like?
Well, relief, I suppose. Yeah, relief. Because a lot of people would think, oh, Frank hasn't got a clue what he was doing, but I pressed on.
For me personally, I felt about bloody time.
From that moment on in the season, I think we were totally dominant. We were a second or two a lap quicker than anybody else, everywhere.
I went on and won the next 3 Grand Prix. Won the Dutch Grand Prix, the Austrian Grand Prix and the German Grand Prix.
And Jones has done it, and he is the world champion.
The world champion of 1982, Keke Rosberg.
He was suddenly a superstar. And it becomes easier for superstars, doesn't it, with somebody around you? It's a bit difficult for blokes when they're superstars. They've got these wonderful sort of pretty girls who are all over them. I think men can be terribly stupid sometimes, and they're probably terribly flattered. I think this is it.
Yes, this is an extra prize.
Yes.
Won this.
Yeah. But I think that was inevitable. I think there were bound to be girls that would try and get their clutches into Frank.
Well, he has an eye for the ladies, Frank. He's always liked a pretty girl.
I, like Frank, had women literally throwing themselves at me. And you can't help every now and again pick one up, can you? I used to get notes put on my windscreen wiper of my car. There were groupies going around the circuit. They were parading up and down the pits. Unreal. We called them screwdrivers. And they did.
With any sport, you get a following of glamorous women who are just there for the action. And they will appear at the parties in the evening, sometimes in the hospitality areas. And a lot of the sponsors employ promotions girls, all tall and long legs and very glamorous.
Formula One is a heady cocktail of strutting temperamental egos and a deep undercurrent of male sexual domination.
When I started, there were very few women working in Formula One. Some of the teams had a female caterer, maybe a husband and wife team. There were press officers who were women. Women were considered to be irrelevant. They made the tea, booked the flights, or provided glamorous accompaniment to drivers and team owners.
But I can remember finding out about somebody and being desperately upset about it. But I think probably I used to overreact to Frank's. Because they weren't, I don't think they were ever affairs. Indiscretions. Yes, I used to overreact, which I think used to annoy him.
Did he used to say to you they're not important, or...?
No, he used to deny it. He used to lie. He used to tell the most dreadful whoppers.
Although she was a perfectionist, she knew that life is always full of compromises, and that was probably one of them. And she'd fallen for Frank, but she'd fallen for Frank as a complete package.
And because she was completely besotted and head over heels, that was it, and she dealt with it. I wouldn't.
Did friends of yours ever say, particularly early on, why do you put up?
Oh, yes.
Could you explain it to me?
No, because, but I mean, I think that they tended to think that I only liked being kicked in the teeth.
Could you imagine at that time a woman being team principal?
No, absolutely no way. Men in motor racing are sexist. They're possibly the most sexist people in any sport. Women are always going to come under more scrutiny because there's a huge body of people within Formula One who still don't believe women can do the same job as men.
I think Formula One traditionally has been quite a male-dominated sport, but there are so many more women now that work in our sport, and that's not just in the high-profile positions. So we've got female engineers, female aerodynamicists, so things are absolutely changing.
So your father is an icon when it comes to Formula One. Was it harder to prove your skills because you're a woman or because he's your father?
Formula One, this role was not my ambition from a little girl. However, kind of circumstances changed and a job became available, and I was asked to do it, not by my dad. And in fact, when he was asked, he said, "No way, is she working for my company?"
So if you're in your private life, in which situations do you enjoy being a woman?
I get asked that female question a lot. I was asked it last night at dinner. I was asked it in 4 interviews I did yesterday. But I still find it quite odd that people find it surprising that a girl might be doing this job. It really kind of annoys me.
Heritage is sort of a nice to-itself department. We have some support from people in the factory, but it's mostly just me and Dickie. So, yeah, it's mostly just us here. Just getting down here to some of the bigger components. You can see much heavier there. They're actually buckling the shelves in here. That box isn't lumbered. Yeah. What have we done here?
Has Claire ever come over here, please?
No. Don't think she knows this room exists. No, nobody comes over here. I don't think.
Me and Johnny. Jonathan wearing his... Johnny used to like playing soldiers quite a lot.
How are things?
Not the best.
Can you talk about that?
Johnny, it's, it's, I suppose some families just have, always going to have, some issues, aren't they? And unfortunately, Johnny and I do, which I think is something that I will regret and be very unhappy about my whole life.
And is that to do with work, or?
Yeah, it is, unfortunately.
But because you got the position that you did, and
yeah,
he didn't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm not the oldest, and I'm not a boy.
That's me and Claire.
You two look pretty close in that one.
That was about 30 years ago.
was horrible. He thinks that I was ambitious and that I put myself in the position, and I lobbied, I cajoled my way in, and the situation could not be further from the truth.
It's something their mother would be deeply unhappy about, and I think it's something that she could have sorted in a way that probably nobody else could. I don't believe Frank could sort it out.
I think Frank has always thought that women are better judges of character than men. And I think Frank used to very often make sure that somebody he was thinking about and wasn't sure about was wheeled my way. This was drivers or
Yes.
Yes, drivers or anybody else. Yes, we had a lot of people through the house, and he would ask what I thought, what my opinion of them was.
I can remember sometime in 1984, and as young children do, waking up earlier than their parents, and just for this man with a moustache and an accent different to ours, obviously being from Birmingham, just walking past and saying good morning, and it scaring the living life out of us, and us both running into my parents' room and saying, "There's a man in the house, there's a man in the house," and them saying, "No, it's Daddy's new driver, that's Nigel Mansell."
The rumours say that you might be going to Williams. What would you have to say about that?
Williams, who are they?
Well, when Nigel's on top form, he was as good as any driver we've ever had, I would say. It was hard work out of the car, but in the car, he was really superb.
Nigel is three people in one. He's an absolutely fantastic racing driver who is just astoundingly good when it comes to overtaking people.
And Mansell moves to the outside, and Mansell's going through. Nigel Mansell takes the lead and neatly boxes Ayrton Senna.
As a family man, he's just the nicest guy. He's got a lovely family. He adores his children. He's faithful to his wife, unlike quite a few racing drivers. But as a person out of the car, he's an absolute arse. He's just a difficult bloke to work with.
Drive slow, get it together. It's a fucking nightmare.
That was why, generally speaking, we all liked Nelson quite a lot and found Nigel a bit too much.
Nelson Piquet replaced Keke Rosberg for 86, and he was hired because Frank loved the idea of Nelson Piquet. He'd already won 2 World Championships, and he loved Nelson's Brazilian flair, his girlfriends, the way he looked, the way he carried himself.
He had a private yacht, and he had a helicopter on the yacht, and he had a Citation 10 jet, which at that time was by far the fastest jet in the world, and he was flying it.
Nelson was ebullient, loved life, and was a very cool guy. Nigel was cheese and chutney sandwiches and hot milk before he went to bed.
I thought at that time Nelson was the best driver in the world, so I was thrilled to bits he was coming. He was very keen to join Williams because he felt that we were the quickest.
Nelson felt with that package around him, he could win another world championship.
We were doing the last of the pre-season tests, the Paul Ricard circuit, so we had both Nigel Mansell and Nelson Piquet there. Frank had come out to the test because he was very excited about the performance.
Dad was away. He was at a pre-season test, and it was a kind of spring afternoon, and Mum suggested we go out on some bikes. And took a little picnic and found a field like you do, and it was a really lovely day. And then we just got back and waiting for Dad to come home, but he never did.
The test was going very well. I think Frank was full of the joys of spring and thinking, right, we're going to go out and show them we can win the World Championship. He was due to run a half marathon on the Sunday morning afterwards.
And Frank, keen to get back for the half marathon he was doing. It was a county half marathon. He was that good.
And so he and Peter Windsor, who was the marketing guy at the time, they went to the airport.
And he had his Avis Ford Sierra. He said, right, come on, let's go.
And then a spot of get home. Have you ever heard of get homeitis?
When you want to just get home?
You've got to go home. Must do. Must catch the last flight.
He took a little twiddly road down through the back of the circuit, and it was a very, very twisty, narrow road.
And he was in this 1600 Sierra, throwing the thing around, braking as late as he could. But I do remember saying to Frank at one moment, when the back end skipped out under braking into a tight left-hander, are the brakes okay on this thing, Frank?
And he said, there's some sort of trepidation. Frank, you always drive like this, meaning, and you can't really tell your bosses, effing well, slow down.
I remember him saying, yeah, the brakes are fine, brakes are fine.
I was rushing and rushing and rushing.
Suddenly we were in clear road. The road was downhill, and there was a fast left-hand kink about 300 yards ahead of us. And I remember seeing through the windscreen a stone wall on the inside. It looked like we were just going to hit the end of this wall. My reaction was just to bury myself in the footwell area. As we hit the back, that wall, the car went up in the air. There was just silence, just a terrible silence. Then this massive thump and crash.
Just, really whack in my neck, sharp pain. It's rolling over, it doesn't hurt like this.
I remember Frank saying, after about 10 seconds, are you okay, you okay? I can't move, I'm trapped, get me out, get the ignition off, because already there was a smell of fuel.
And I'm suspended about 3-4 inches from the floor, upside down.
And there's a lot of blood, because he'd taken a direct blow on his head when the roof had come down like that.
Sue undid the belt, so of course I fell on my bleeding head right on my neck again.
The only thing I could remember was to try to stabilize his head and neck and try to pull him out by holding him under the armpits. And then he started to say, Peter, I'm a Roman Catholic, and if anything happens, I want to see if we can get the last rites.
We were just looking at packing up when a French youth arrived on a moped asking for me, and he explained that Frank Williams had gone off the road and wanted some help. But Nelson said, oh shit, that's a twisty road. I know the road, let's go down and see.
We didn't know exactly the damage, but we knew it was something very dramatic.
We raced to the scene as quickly as we could, and at that time, Frank's life was in the balance.
And that's when Nigel delegated himself really to go to the ambulance with Frank, basically hold Frank's hand and be with him.
I had a tremendous fear for Frank's safety and his well-being and life at that time. So certain people needed to be energised to do the right thing quickly.
But by then it was pretty clear that there was a very good chance that he's broken his neck. When I phoned Patrick Head, I told him that it looks like from the x-rays that Frank's spinal column's been cut. And it was pretty... I think I said to him, I think he's fucked. Like, he looked really bad.
The next day, Ginny and I flew down to Marseille, and she was pretty shattered, but she was the brave woman.
I was trying to fight panic, I think. I was clinging onto life by a thread. I threw myself at Peter. I think I did. Yes. I sort of collapsed on his shoulder. Yes.
The first time that I knew that things were going to be really serious was when the doctor in charge of the intensive care unit called Ginny and I into his office and said, when do you want to move Frank back to England? Which I immediately took to mean they think he's going to die and they don't want him to die in their hospital.
He said to me, just how much more effort do you want us to make to keep your husband alive? Sort of crossly. If anybody's cross with me, I just be cross with them back. It's my only method of defence. I think he thought that he should be left to die. So I stood there and I told him to make every bloody effort that he could.
At that stage, when Ginny got the message that the frogs were going to let Frank die, she organised a plane, flew him back to Heathrow, an ambulance took him to the London hospital, and 20 minutes later, he was hooked up to English machines, and he was in a shocking state.
The first thing that happened to Frank was that he had a tracheotomy operation in the London hospital, and the operation went well in the sense that suddenly Frank had relief and he could breathe, he could get the fluid out of his lungs. And I remember Ginny learnt how to operate the extraction of the fluid and would help the nurses, and was able to do that on her own within a day or two. Her approach was, I'm going to manage these nurses around Frank's bed here the way Frank runs a race team.
I also wanted to mark my corner, you know, I wanted to make it quite clear. There was that sort of, like a dog, I mean, almost that sort of feeling, you know, a dog marks its territory. I wanted to make it quite clear this was my territory.
Ginny was literally his guardian. He clinically died 3 times, and without Ginny jumping on top of him and pumping his lungs out and resuscitating him, not the nurses and the doctors, but Ginny herself, he would have been dead.
I remember I was off one day and Ginny was on duty, as she called it. The head of the unit came out and said, normally, Mrs. Williams, in this situation, we would turn the life support off, but we need the family's permission.
And I asked Peter whether does he think we should let Frank die? But he said, Ginny, no, Frank wants to live. He'll have to make major adjustments, but he has his children. There are trees, there is sunshine, he's a determined character, everybody loves him, he's very special. He won't want us to give up that easily.
Did you ever doubt whether Frank should be kept alive?
Yeah, and I actually said to him, Frank, I'm your best pal, I'll do anything for you. You want a bag over your head? I'll do it for you. I promise you I said this. I said, but you'd have to convince me first why your kids want you around in any condition. I said, so don't ask me to do anything that your kids wouldn't approve of. So he said, I won't do that, David. That was when he was speaking. He said, I'll never do that.
So this is a book that I wrote when I was little. I thought that it would be a good idea to start a kind of scrapbook all about my father. Above all, I wanted somewhere to write down all my memories of him before my mind had the chance to forget them. Hopefully I will never forget what he used to be like before his accident. Everyone thinks their father is the best. I'm not an exception. I worship my father. It sounds silly, but he's my hero.
I started taking CDs and things like that for him to listen to fill in the time a bit. Because you have to remember, he was a marathon runner. You know, he used to run 12 miles every day and felt bad if he didn't, and it was a spectacularly big change of life for Frank when he had his accident.
And so what kind of music did you introduce him to?
Bach.
Well, I thought that my pal Frank was indestructible. You know, he got away with everything. Frank would be all right, but he wasn't on this one. And I'd go and see him 3 or 4 times a week. I always gave him a kiss, had to. Lean over, give him a kiss on the forehead and say, your old mate Brode's here, mate. And he used to flicker his eyelids at that. He couldn't speak. Stuff in his mouth, up his nose. Oh, it was a horrible sight.
Well, there was a lot of discomfort and pain in the very early days. That's just inevitable when such a major part of your body gets a kick in the ass. But I can't say, oh, it was terrible, it's not in my mind. I don't remember much of that. The body's got a great many ways of protecting itself when it's in a bit of pain or bother. First thing I said, broken your neck, long recovery period, how much you'll recover isn't sure. Of course they knew I wouldn't recover, but you don't quite tell a person when he wakes up you're effed, mate, for good.
Probably for the first time in front of me, Virginia, she lost it. It was a sort of an awful moment, and I remember putting my arms around her and she was saying, he's quadriplegic, he can't walk, Jamie, he can't do anything. And I was saying, it's going to be okay, but I had this sort of feeling I wasn't sure at all that it was going to be okay.
For a long time, maybe 3-4 months after the accident, there was no real certainty that he'd ever be able to leave the hospital, and to all intents and purposes, he was dead to the team.
You know, there we were the fastest car, we were going to win all the races, we got 2 fantastic drivers and everything was going, and then all of a sudden, the boss, the figurehead, the main man, had this horrific accident, and it really was a massive change.
I think then it sort of dawned on us all, where do we go from here? What's going to happen in '86?
We await the start of the Brazilian Grand Prix and the 1986 season. Sadly, Frank Williams, boss of the Williams team, isn't here after a major road accident in France. But for the whole team, that's an added incentive to do well.
Well, they went to work with a vengeance. Instead of them all moping about, they said, you tell Frank you don't have to worry about a thing here. We're going to win the next races for him.
And it's go. A superb start for Nigel Mansell, who has already passed Nelson Piquet. But it's Senna, Mansell, Piquet is the running order at the present moment. Mansell's touching wheels with Ayrton Senna.
We went to the first race and Nigel crashed on the first lap whilst trying to overtake Senna in a very stupid manoeuvre.
Mansell appears to be out of the race, so up into second position. It's now Piquet. Alboreto is up into third place. And through into the lead goes Nelson Piquet. Nelson Piquet leads on lap 3. This one is for you, Frank. Nelson Piquet wins the 1986 Brazilian Grand Prix, and you will hear the crowd go absolutely mad.
I can say it was a very special day for me. I think it's a good present for Frank. I think he's there lying in bed, and I think he'll be happy to watch the race, and we hope God help Frank also.
It was clear we had the best car, and the only thing that was going to come between us and winning the championship was lots of intra-team rivalry between Nelson and Nigel. I think that was used, actually, to motivate Frank. We need you, Frank, to manage these two guys, because there's going to be problems if we just let them race free rein, and we need to get on top of this quite quickly.
Nelson claimed that Frank had said, you will be #1 driver, you will always have the spare car, and the team will revolve around you.
I came there to win the championship. I came there like a #1 driver.
Problem was, Nigel didn't sign as a #2 driver, so he drove as fast as he could, and quite a lot of the time, that was faster than Nelson was going.
Nigel used to drive straight at him, because Nigel was pretty aggressive. I mean, a couple of times Nelson said to me, I had two choices, be second or die.
I must have been a nightmare to drive with as a #2, being as quick as I was at times.
I mean, that was horrendous. You know, they hated each other.
Nelson insisted that we went into the hospital and saw an almost dead, croaking Frank, saying, Frank, you said that this and whatever, and Patrick is running the team so that we're equal #1s with Nigel, and that's not what you said to me. And Frank was, I mean, I don't think Frank could reply to him. He was almost out of it.
When things didn't go as well as they should have for Nelson, in other words, when Nigel was quicker, Nelson assumed that it could only be because Nigel Mansell had been given preferential treatment.
100% the English team want to win an English driver. Williams for sure want to make an English champion, not me.
Nelson thinks that there was a bias towards Nigel because he was British.
I think that's not true. There could have been, but Nigel was such an arse that it was very difficult to have an actual bias to him. I mean, on one occasion, I do remember he was whinging about something. Oh, did you see what he did to me then? On the radio. And Patrick said on the radio, for fuck's sake, stop whinging, Nigel, and switched his radio off.
Patrick carried the business by absence. It was very hard on him. Patrick was left lumbered with an enormous amount of responsibility he wasn't ready for.
I was up to my eyebrows with two guys that both were determined to be world champion that year, and were not going to take for me saying, sorry, I can't make a decent job of running your car because I'm too worried about Frank Williams. So it was a very stressful, very difficult time in the team.
And everything went complete disaster for me. But Frank was not there. And I couldn't come to the hospital and say, Frank, it's happened this, it's happened that. It's not fair. His problem was much more than my problem.
Frank was still in intensive care, and he remained in intensive care for quite a time. And it was another, I think it was 12 weeks before he eventually came home. But they were the longest weeks you could imagine.
We all were just relieved and thrilled that Dad made it and he was home and we got him home. Yes, it was a very different kind of life, but we had Dad still and we were a family still. And he still had Formula One, and that's what kept him going.
Frank Williams is quadriplegic. From his shoulders down, he has no control over the functions of his own body. Less than 6 months after the accident, he had ruthlessly forced enough movement into his partly functioning shoulders to push himself along. But his arms are just pistons of flesh and bone, with no feeling.
He's paralyzed from his shoulders, literally downwards. He can lift his arms, and he can, for example, if he wants to catch him in his face, he pushes his hands against his face. But he can't use his fingers.
Why does it say hell on wheels?
It's because Dad's life is hell in a wheelchair. He's always in a lot of pain all the time. I don't think people realise that, how much pain Frank is in every day of his life, every minute of every day.
You wouldn't know it though, would you?
No, you wouldn't think he has anything to complain about. Dad never does think he has anything to complain about. It's a lovely picture of Mum and... Well, I'm not so good at Dad. Lovely of Mum.
Oh, and what about Ginny? How did Ginny react?
Well, it was tough, very tough lady. But she didn't fall apart. She took very good care of me. It must be very hard for her. Suddenly not to have a proper husband anymore, and they have to spend our time looking after him.
It's very difficult for anyone who hasn't lived with a quadriplegic to know what it's like to almost lose your husband, but not quite.
Whatever was it like not being able to sleep with Frank? I mean, we're talking about sex here, just the warmth, I suppose. Yes, I can just remember thinking, my God, not be able to sleep in the same bed with Frank. Yeah. So I was fine, although I'd spent lots of nights without him in my life because he'd been away, sort of reality was hitting me. I'd probably never spend a night in bed with him again.
Well, their relationship clearly was likely to change in that Frank needed care at all times of the day and day and night. So if it was a different kind of life for Frank, it was going to be an equally different kind of life for Virginia.
I'm not usually given to making New Year's resolutions, but at the end of 1988, I decided that I would spend the following year setting down everything that has happened to Frank and me in the last 2 decades, both before and after the car accident, which left him permanently paralysed from the neck down. I felt it might act as an exorcism, a way to put it all behind me and start to look forward again.
Reading it was like, Jesus Christ, she went through this and she didn't tell anyone. You know, she didn't share that burden with anybody.
Why do you think she shared it then?
She says that it was a cathartic exercise for her. Because Dad's the star, isn't he? Dad's the one in the spotlight, and Dad's the one that everyone goes, Frank Williams is amazing, Frank Williams is wonderful. And for all those years, Mum had been in the background. I don't think she did it. She didn't want to do it because she wanted fame or adulation. She just did it because she wanted people to know the full story.
His memory of the early days after his accident is blurred and vague. He has never asked me what it was like in France or in the London hospital, or what it has been like for me these past few years. Now he will know.
Have you read a book?
Don't want to.
Why do you not want to read it?
Then that's a peculiar emotion.
I think I would like him to read it because I think that it would be respectful to Mum to understand what she did go through. But I just, I think, I don't know, I just think it's probably too much for Dad to read it. He doesn't feel any need to, but I wish he would.
Do you think you ever will read it?
Maybe. Before I die, but not imminently, that's for sure.
That picture must be Frank's first Grand Prix after his accident. Big change of life for all of us.
When Frank appeared in the wheelchair, the crowd just went crazy.
It's very fun to be with the team. It's very fun to be on a racetrack.
Back at the track, Frank Williams savoured his team's success for the first time this season. Piquet and Mansell took first and third places in practice.
He did a really sort of symbolic visit, but he was determined to be there because he wanted the world of Formula One to know that he was still around and ostensibly still in control. But he played no part at all and was very much a show appearance.
But my father only attended on the Friday, the practice day, and that was all he was physically up for.
The lights for red, and go! And Piquet leads. Mansell is second into Clearways. The two Williams cars in their battle for leadership, toe to toe, eyeball to eyeball, almost wheel to wheel.
Nelson and Nigel really started to slug it out with one another. Nigel wasn't afraid to be half an inch away from anybody if he had to be, and he was. And it was serious motor racing between the two Williams Honda drivers.
And there he goes. Nigel Mansell leads the British Grand Prix from the man that is his greatest competition. Piquet's going for it as they go down into the right-hander, and Paddock and Mansell's absolutely on the racing line. There are no orders between these two.
On the pit wall, that was the first time I remember not actually enjoying the race because I was so sweaty palmed as to what might happen between the two of them. And I think Frank was back home watching it on TV, probably as nervous as the rest of the team was at that point.
Piquet going through on the inside, but he's going to be blocked, and he has been, and Mansell holds the lead. Great stuff! Nigel Mansell exits the last corner, crosses the line, and Mansell is the winner! Great stuff! Wonderful drive! Nigel has broken his back, he's broken his leg. He is now #1 in the World Championship, and just listen to the crowd!
After the race, it wasn't normal for a team manager or team representative to be on the podium. But on this occasion, because Frank had been there for the test, and because it was Nigel, and because it was Brands Hatch, Ginny was invited up to take the Constructors' Trophy on behalf of Frank.
Now behind Anna Prost, the woman is Ginny Williams. You'll just see her in a minute, I expect. There's Ginny Williams and Patrick Head, the designer of the winning Williams car. Oh, what a day.
And there is Ginny holding up the trophy.
To me, that photograph is one of my favourite photographs of Ginny because she's got this expression on her face where it's just like, yes.
It was a tremendous moment because of what Ginny had gone through. Because the accident just didn't happen to Frank, it happened to everybody. But the closest person it happened to was his dear wife.
Hi, Preston.
How you doing there, Jimmy Doppler? Good Biggles under control, is he? Very hard work, isn't it?
Ma se lei può dire soltanto che lo cercavo, non è urgente, se può chiamarmi a casa stanotte?
The best therapy Frank ever had was being back at his desk with a phone that Nelson gave him, actually, which allowed him to tap big numbers on a pad, and he had a headset on, and make his own phone calls. Mentally, he said, as long as I'm on the phone, so long as I can talk, I'm going motor racing.
Si chiama Basel Hill Road. Telex oggi col nostro indirizzo, allora. Grazie.
Mentally, how do you think the disability has affected Frank?
I did ask him a couple of times when we're alone in the car if he sometimes thinks of running again and stuff like that. But he said he gave that thought up completely. He's completely in peace with the situation. And I think this is also what you get from him. He's not sitting there and thinks, oh shit, I should have. Just got on with it.
I can truthfully, and I'm not bragging, I had a major business on my mind, a racing team, because I have a hard-on all your life.
It's like having a hard-on all your life.
I'm like you jealous of what I do. I run a Grand Prix team. I own a Grand Prix team. I run racing cars and world-famous drivers all of the time. I think it's a great privilege.
It's Jamie's birthday today, Dad. Dad, you need to choose which card you want to give him.
It's on my finger. I'm about 28.
He's about 32, actually, Dad, now. Yeah.
Yeah. That's my signature. it's a bit drunken, but... Jamie, it took that 2 hours to do this, Jamie.
So Dad always gives us money for birthdays, all the time.
I'll give you some money. I'm giving you money.
You're giving him money, I've organised it. So if Dad had his way, because he has no idea the value of money anymore, because he hasn't been into a shop for about 45 years, he would give us all 50p. So we have to do it for him.
Absolutely untrue.
It is true, but you don't really know what things cost anymore, do you?
Not really, no.
How much does a newspaper cost?
Up to 15 pence.
15 pence?
Yes.
I personally just wanted to say, along with, I know, my dad, just thank you so much for all the work that you've done so far this year. I know it's been a really, really long season for everybody. I know maybe there's a little bit of disappointment that we weren't a little bit better this year, but I think everybody needs to really remember where we came from, and it's only been 2 years since we were 9th in the championship.
When Williams were 3rd in the championship in Abu Dhabi, I went into the garage at the end of the race and I stood at the back until the TV cameras had finished with Claire. And I said, I think Mum is in here and she's watching over you and she's thrilled.
Just saying to Dad, it feels like forever since she's been gone. I think Mum would have been a brilliant team principal, you know. I think she would have been probably the best team principal Formula One had ever seen if you'd just let her. I think secretly she would have quite liked to have been TP.
Nell's an extremely good race engineer, knows his car setups. Going to get in a car and perhaps everybody's going to have the new automatic transmissions, and you know, there are things that you're just going to be just one step behind everybody else.
Virginia was diagnosed with cancer in the summer of 2010. I think she knew in her heart of hearts that it was going to get her, and it was just a question of when.
She was sort of taken for granted in as much as, you know, she was hale, hearty and fit and well, and Frank wasn't. So it was not in anyone's mind, I guess, that she was as vulnerable as she obviously Was.
I miss her. She was a lovely lady. And I don't know how Frank copes without her, because he doesn't have a lot of people to go home to talk to anymore. It's quite sad, really.
I think it affected him very deeply, more deeply possibly than he would have imagined. And I think that he probably came after her death to realise just how much he loved her.
She was the foundation of Frank's life outside motor racing. It was the only thing, you know, and he did say, I'm not bothering to go home anymore. Now Ginny's gone, he'd just sleep in his flat in the factory, didn't bother to go home. Why bother?
I kept down the corridors most nights of the week.
Down the corridor in the factory?
Yeah.
How are you?
Good, actually. Good.
Well, it's lovely and warm in here for you, Dad. Turn the heating up. Well, you haven't read the book, have you, Pops?
Yeah. I must make the effort to do so, yeah.
You should. You should make the effort. It's an amazing book. So you must read it.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay.
You should do. Although it's quite sad.
Yeah.
It is quite sad. Sometimes I dream that Frank is running through the Berkshire lanes. Everything is all right. Early in the morning, in that split second between sleeping and waking, I sometimes forget, as one might forget what day it is, that Frank is paralysed. Then the knife blade of reality twists sharply in my stomach, jerking me back to the present. How must Frank feel in that same moment of semi-consciousness? What a nightmare to wake up to be a prisoner within your own body, not even to be able to get out of bed until someone else moves you. Frank also dreams. He says that usually in his dreams too, he is running. He has made a magical recovery, and everyone is astonished to see him return to fitness and turns to watch as he races past them. We are, and always have been, two quite different characters. Frank has never wasted his time bemoaning the past. It's one of his many strengths. The past means nothing to him, whether it's a world championship won or lost, or a road accident that crippled him. It's yesterday, it's boring. Today and tomorrow are what count. I, in contrast, am happiest with the past. I prefer the past to the future. That frightens me now. What happened to my dreams? I wanted us to grow old together. I wanted to die in Frank's arms. I'm going to stop crying. We have both grown as a result of the experience. But if a fairy godmother offered to wave her magic wand and take us back to the way things were when I first married Frank, I would not hesitate for a second. I would happily exchange the houses, the executive jets, the smart hotel rooms, the gold Rolexes for just one night in a scruffy bedroom anywhere in the world with a selfish, funny, unsympathetic, unreliable, charismatic man I married. I laugh much more than I used to. It helps to stop me crying.
Tough stuff, eh?
I haven't read it since Mum died, and it's about how she will go to her grave heartbroken over what happened to you. You should be very proud.
I still think that somehow he was happier in those struggling days than he was in the days when we were flying the flag at and winning every race. Sounds odd to say, but I think he does need a challenge. I think he thrived on it. He's been racing to be in racing. I think he's in it for the love of it.
And what about going to the races? Do you think you'll still be able to go to the Grand Prix this year?
Why not?
I don't know, doctor's orders?
I'm fine. I mean, I'm paralysed, but I haven't had a day off work. I don't think I've had a day off work in years. I just don't get ill. Never have done.
Frank's personality hasn't changed. What he can physically do has. But his approach to his racing, his love of Formula One, his obsession with it is just the same now as it has been as long as I've known him.
So how does a man like that retire?
He's not going to retire, he's going to die on the job.
Well, Frank will never stop. He will stop when he closes his eyes.
Do you think you'll see Williams on top again in your lifetime?
Yeah, it's certainly possible.